Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is our Wednesday Millennial Round Table, and we have both of our experts in studio. First time we've been able to do that. A couple of weeks ago, we did have Nick Pitts in studio, as we always do, but we had Allie Beth Stuckey by phone, but she is in studio with us today. So, Nick, this is really going to be a great program, don't you think?
I am so excited. Especially since she's from Georgia. You know, I was really expecting, because the Atlanta Falcons, I didn't know she'd actually be here.
Yeah.
You know, I finally picked myself up today for the first time since Sunday. Got over my bereavement and my disappointment, and now I'm back into the real world. So I made it.
From Atlanta. Now, after all, even though New England won, I think Atlanta Falcons won the popular vote, right?
Exactly, exactly. I'm still actually in the midst of gathering around my friends and protesting, just to see if we can change anything, but nothing yet.
Nothing yet. So we'll see if we get anybody out on the street. Some of our Georgia listeners would like to join you on that protest. But again, we are just privileged to have both of them in studio today. If you're not familiar, of course, Nick Pitts has been with us many times before with the Denison Forum, and almost ready to get your PhD. Pretty amazing.
There is light at the end of the tunnel. And, you know, it is going to be so interesting. I don't know what to do with myself right now.
You've written all the chapters, right?
I've written all the chapters, and I'm just waiting on revisions. And so I find myself wondering, what do people do with them? What do people do when they're not writing dissertations?
Yeah.
So
we'll have something for you to do.
Okay,
so
good.
That's going to be. Allie
kind.
Beth, of course, you have this wonderful blog. We have a link to it as well. A conservative blogger, and it's the Conservative Millennials. So this is just a great opportunity for you to be in studio with us,
I'm
and we're looking forward more of that. And let's just go to your first piece, because one of the things we've posted here was kind of a counterpoint that you did, actually with yourself, but nevertheless with this alter ego. So one conservative, one liberal, about the Muslim ban.
Yes.
Very, very creative. I encourage people to watch the video and see what you've been able to do just in that studio. But again, this is one of the issues that millennials are going to be thinking about for some time, because we have the executive order from President Donald Trump. We had the oral arguments given yesterday at the Ninth Circuit Court, and we're waiting maybe even before the end of the program today to see what their verdict might be.
Yes.
What about this?
Yeah, so, well, you hear a lot of liberal millennials and just liberals in general saying that this is both unconstitutional and unprecedented. So that's kind of where the outcry is coming from. In reality, neither of those things are actually true. And since there aren't really too many facts surrounding those two accusations, what liberals sometimes like to do is just kind of name call the people that are for the travel ban, saying that we're very exclusive, that we're un-American, different things like that. So I just kind of wanted to offer the fact-based perspective that conservatives do have on this travel ban.
Yes. Nick, let me come to that for just a minute, because if you ask the question about is it constitutional, I remember there was a stamp that Antonin Scalia had on his desk, and it stamp said stupid but constitutional. Now, I'm not saying that this is stupid, but I'm just saying what he was saying is you may not like a law, you may not like a policy, you may not agree with what the Congress did, but that's not the issue. Courts are supposed to determine whether something's constitutional or not constitutional.
That's exactly right. And I think what we even see this epitomized in just the nominee that Donald Trump's put forward with Neil Gorsuch, right? He has the famous quote that if I agreed with everything that I ruled, then I probably am not doing it right. That inevitably it's not your preference and it's not your agenda from a judge standpoint, but it really is, what does the Constitution say? And so it's going to be interesting to kind of see how this plays out. So if the Ninth Circuit Court rules in favor or against it, and then does it move forward from there up to the Supreme Court? Who knows?
Well, it is interesting because you had the three justices, and two of them spent more time talking about what Donald Trump said on the campaign trail.
Right.
And I'm thinking that has nothing to do whether he had good motives or bad motives, whether he had lots of tweets or no tweets at all. The issue should be, Allie Beth, just whether it's constitutional, correct?
Right. And judges are supposed to be interpreting the law, not creating the law based on their political leanings. And that's kind of what we think that we're going to see with the Ninth Circuit, is that that's kind of what they're doing. They're pulling things out of his campaign, things that they just don't like or that they prefer he didn't say, and trying to use it against him. To me, that's just really bad judicial practice. And if you want to talk about something that's unconstitutional and unprecedented, then I would talk about that.
Yeah, I would think so as well. Last week, you and Penna Dexter spent some time talking about Neil Gorsuch, and that's kind of important to recognize that if we begin to move a court towards looking at what the law says and not what I want the outcome to be, the Neil Gorsuch quote, that's kind of a different kind of Supreme Court than we've had in the recent years, isn't it?
Yeah, it's really interesting. Just to kind of build on Allie's point, we know that Lady Justice is blind for a reason. There's a wrap around her eyes for a reason, in order just to be judicious, to be fair. And I think what we see with Neil Gorsuch is we have this person that he's proven himself, that he's got the kind of the educational acumen of going from Columbia to Harvard and then to Oxford. He has been ruling on the court for 10 plus years, and what we see, not only does he have the experience, but he also has the competency that even those that are on the other side of the aisle are praising him because of what he's done. Specifically, the New York Times op-ed that was offered by Neil Katnor. And so it's just very interesting days that we find ourselves in.
Well, again, this is our Millennial Round Table. We're looking at the moment on some of the issues in the news, but a little bit later we're going to look at millennials in general. And of course, if you are a millennial, would love to hear from you, but even not, this is just one of those programs that we're going to continue doing because this generation really does need to have some perspective, and we certainly want to provide some of that as well. Let me come back to the letter of the law. If you go to section 1152 of Title 8, it grants the president of the capacity to suspend entry of anyone detrimental to the interest of the United States. Now, today, when President Trump was speaking to some of the law enforcement officials in Washington, D.C., he read that. And, Allie Beth, that's pretty straightforward. 19 different times, if I have counted correctly, President Obama, in one way or another, limited immigration, and I never heard a federal judge or a circuit court strike anything that he did down. But now, the first time President Trump does it, we have this legal battle, don't we?
Right. They're making it a lot more about morality and politics than they are about actually what the Constitution says. Like you said, it's pretty black and white. Very few things are actually black and white. But that is what the Constitution says. And like you said, it could be stupid. They could think it's stupid. They could think it's morally wrong. They could think politically it's a bad move. But it is constitutional. And that's their job, to decide what's constitutional and what's not. Take politics in your own biased perspective on what is moral and what isn't, and just tell us what the Constitution says, and you'll get the right answer.
I would think so. That's what we ask from any kind of judge, don't you think?
I completely agree. And so what we're seeing is just this melding together of what we see just endemically within the American society, that everything is political now, that that we're in a constant campaign in which we're always trying to vie. And one of the difficulties of being in a constant campaign is everybody's always your enemy. Yeah. And so there's just no more differentiation between campaigning and governing, but now everything's a campaign whereby we're continually divided.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, I want to talk about that moral issue, because some are saying, well, none of these refugees would be terrorists, and I have some facts and figures to say, well, some are. Now, true, most refugees are fleeing terrorism, but some refugees want to bring terrorism. So we'll look at that, a moral argument. And then I've not had a chance to talk with either of you about my hometown, Berkeley, California. There was a protest at the University of California at Berkeley, and for someone who grew up during the free speech movement. I used to go to a liberal church across the street when in 1964 Mario Savio and others started the free speech movement. It was kind of shocking to me that you actually shut down another conservative speaker on a college campus. I'd love to get some of your comments about that as well. We'll take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Nick Pitts and Allie Beth Stuckey. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, critics of President Donald Trump's wall say that it is too expensive. And I think this criticism provides a great opportunity to remind people how much money the federal government spends. So let's take a moment and look at what such a wall might cost and compare it to other items in the federal budget. When I was on the radio the other day, I reminded my audience that the federal budget last year was $3.8 trillion. If you divide that amount by 365 days in the year, you will find that each day the federal government spends about $10.4 billion. Some have estimated that the wall President Trump is proposing might cost about $12 to $15 billion, which would probably be spread over about 2 to 3 years. The total cost of the wall over that period of time equals about 1.5 days of the federal operating cost. Jeff Poore wrote a column recently about questionable federal government expenditures that exceed Trump's wall. A Government Accountability Office report estimated in 2014 that the federal government made $59 billion in improper Medicare payments and $17 billion in improper Medicaid payments. The total of $76 billion would be roughly the cost of 5 border walls. The Lockheed Martin F-35 stealth fighter jet projects cost an estimated $379 billion. That would be roughly the cost of 25 border walls. The Earned Income Tax Credit provides $69 billion in benefits to 28 million households. And while we're talking about poverty, consider the cost of the more than the 50-year war on poverty. Taxpayers have footed a bill for $22 trillion, which would be 1,466 border walls. Once you put the cost of a wall in context, you can begin to see that it wouldn't be one of the largest expenditures in the federal government. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, it is our Millennial Round Table, and we have 2 millennials here who, again, are experts on that and will give us their perspective. But the program is called Point of View, so we welcome your point of view as well. And your phone calls, 1-800-351-1212. Nick Pitts, Allie, Beth, Stuckey, and let's get into the moral argument for just a minute. A lot of people were saying, look, this is ridiculous because most everybody that comes to this country, even from these 7 countries that are being targeted right now, which again were not created by President Trump. They were created under the Obama administration: Iraq, Syria, Iran, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Yemen. That these individuals are fleeing terrorism. They're not bringing it. Well, it turns out that the federal government has arrested and convicted at least 73 people from those 7 countries of Iran, Iraq, Libya, Somalia, Syria, Sudan, and Yemen, which you wouldn't have known last night or even over the weekend when Judge Robart said there were actually 0 arrests from those countries. You, of course, have, if you go to Paris and Brussels, had 10 jihadis who entered Europe as refugees. And then we can begin to look at some of the other rather striking numbers about that. You had 8 refugees that were charged in a federal court a number of years ago. Before that, you had 2 Iraqi refugees which were arrested in Bowling Green, Kentucky. And now we even have some that the FBI said they found now dozens of counterterrorism investigations that failed to vet a number of these refugees. So let's be honest, not all refugees are terrorists, but some refugees could be. Is that fair?
Right, exactly. And I think any precaution that we can take, especially in a time where we're actually at war with Islamic terrorism, is probably a wise precaution to take. And it's a temporary ban. I think that's something that a lot of people are forgetting. It's been exacerbated, of course, by the liberal media saying that this is a ban on all Muslims forever and always, eternally. We're trying to, support white supremacy, when that is just not true at all. It's a temporary ban from certain countries. It's not a Muslim ban. If it was, it would be completely ineffective because there are millions of Muslims around the world that are totally unaffected by this ban. So if that were the goal, then President Trump and President Obama would have failed miserably.
Yeah, more Muslims from Indonesia than any other country in the world. Egypt has the largest population of Muslims in the Middle East. Turkey also one of the largest. Not bans on any of those countries, right?
Yeah, and so what's so fascinating, I think Allie Beth touched on it, is there's just this false dichotomy that's being put forward. There's some that are saying that it's a complete ban. There's not going to be any more immigrants for the rest of the United States experiment. And then there's others that are saying we shouldn't have no walls whatsoever. There should be no restrictions, everybody in. And those are just two false dichotomies that aren't helpful for anybody except the people that make money off the arguments that we're making right now. But the reality is there is going to be a temporary ban to better understand and better account for the people that are coming in here. Because at the end of the day, the government, from a limited government perspective, one of the sole responsibilities is going to be to protect the people. And so what we want is protection of the people. We all remember how we felt after 9/11. We all remember how much of a marker that was whenever you lose someone significant. And so what the government is just trying to do right now is to get a better accounting of the people so that we don't recreate those feelings. We learn from the past and don't recreate it.
Let's think about it biblically for just a minute. If I can quote from Jim Denison, your boss there at the Denison Forum, he put out a piece the other day that I thought was very good, in which he had 3 points. Point number one is we understand biblically that boundaries are important. You had boundaries in the Old Testament. You had various boundaries that were given to Moses and to others, and even the idea of protecting boundaries. Then you have the idea in Romans 13 and other passages that government is to bear the sword. And so government does have a responsibility there to protect us. And then the third principle is the idea of having compassion for those who are refugees or immigrants. And it seems to me, Allie Beth, that if we have those two ideas in tension, the rule of law, but also treat those who are here either legally or illegally, at least with compassion, then you'll come up with an answer that's a little bit better than the one we see in the streets right now.
Absolutely. I think people get confused about what Jesus' teachings and his character means for government versus what it means for individuals. So a lot of people like to use the argument, for example, that Jesus was a socialist. He would have voted for Bernie Sanders and he would be letting all of the Syrian refugees in. I don't want to say exactly, but I don't think that's necessarily true. Jesus, of course, when it comes to the argument of socialism, told us to give freely from our hearts, not from government compulsion. And I think the same thing is true when it comes to refugees. There is a way to govern that is still compassionate, that is still righteous, that is still good, while also protecting your citizens from outside harm. That's called prudence. That's called wisdom. And that's a blessing that God also gives and tells us to have.
Yeah. Michael Brown the other day had a piece, Nick, that was interesting. He said, isn't this interesting that those individuals in Hollywood and the academy that oftentimes refer to the Old Testament as misogynistic and Islamophobic and homophobic,
Their
now all of a
words.
sudden they are quoting from the same Old Testament passages.
For some strange reason, they'll hate Deuteronomy 26, but Deuteronomy 10 about the immigrant, it's all about it.
That's all good.
But the reality is, I think Jesus isn't for the left wing. He's not for the right wing. He's for the whole bird.
Yeah.
And so what we see with Jesus is there is just an individual that says, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's and to man the things that are man. When we render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, we're to give Caesar the proper honor and respect from Romans 13:7. We understand it to be true that we are a nation of laws, and contingent upon a nation of laws surviving is the ability for the people to be able to obey those laws, or for the government to be able to restrain evil to enforce the good and bring about the peace. So yes, we are a nation of immigrants, but we're also a nation of laws. But then on the flip side, it does open up the opportunity, as what Edmund Burke said, for these little pontoons of goodness in society to be able to go and do the good work. The Kiwanis clubs, the Rotaries, the local churches, because government is an inefficient vehicle by which good can be done. But these local organizations, the little platoons, are phenomenal organizations by which common grace can be extended into the entire country.
Well, again, what about this idea that to be pro-life is to be pro-refugee, to be pro-life is to be pro-Muslim? What about that? You're doing biblical studies right now. What about that?
Yeah, so, of course, we want to believe it to be true that life begins at conception. It's from womb to tomb, right? And so there's the idea that we want to care for and provide and create a conducive atmosphere by which a mother can bring a child into this world. And should they not have the opportunity and the necessary resources to be able to bring up this child, that hopefully communities can come around and to be able to help this mother and help this child. But then on the flip side, that we also want to be ones that care for individuals until the tomb as well. And so the idea of assisted suicide is just kind of an affront to the biblical narrative. The idea of eugenics is just an affront to the scriptures, because we believe it to be true that people are worthy regardless of whether they are worthless or not.
Yeah. What about this idea of pro-life? Sometimes they make pro-life broader than I think what people even in the pro-life movement understand it to be.
Right. And it's also interesting that the people that tell me that I need to separate my religious stance from my stance on abortion are also the same people asking me, what would Jesus do when it comes to the refugees? So I just kind of find an irony in that, kind of like we were talking about the passages in Deuteronomy. But they do. And I don't think people that bring pro-choice, people who bring pro-life into the argument about refugees, really know what they're getting themselves into, because I would kind of turn it around and say, well, if you're okay with obliterating a child in the womb for the sake of convenience, why are you for bringing Syrian refugees in? That might bring danger to America. Where do you find a parallel in that? Yeah. And, they don't have an answer.
Yeah. Greg Kokel's been on this program before, and he has a great line. He says, everybody wants Jesus on their team, which is why you see these protests, or even maybe the gay pride parade where it'll say, this is what Jesus said about homosexuality, is blank. Or I've seen bumper stickers that said, would Jesus drive an SUV? Why would you even ask that question? But nevertheless, everybody wants Jesus on their team.
Because we know he'd drive a Ford F-150. I mean, let's just be honest. I'm from Tennessee, completely biased, but we know Jesus is going to be driving a Ford F-150. But the reality of the matter is, it's just so frustrating. It just reminds me kind of what Abraham Lincoln, right? That we always want God on our side, but the real question is, are we on God's side? And we want to be sure that not only are we people that can give a response for the hope that's within us, but also people that demonstrate that with both our words and our deeds as well.
Or a Chevy Tahoe. Whatever it might be. Hey, let's take a break. Just before we do so, let me just mention that we have all sorts of great resources. We have some material from Nick Pitt's Daily Briefing. We have, of course, the Conservative Millennial, and you are going to really enjoy watching the video that we've posted there. And as you go there, you'll also notice that we are still talking about our Alaska cruise, August 5 through 12th, and it will be this year. Penna Dexter and her family will be with us. Kelly Shackelford and his family will be with us, and it's just an opportunity for you to join with us to enjoy the wilds of Alaska, but also to have some of the conversation. And I want to try to figure out a way in the future we can bring Nick, get this Tennessee boy on a dog sled. That would be something, right?
Watch out, especially if it's cruise. I've been known to be able to sing a couple of tunes in the karaoke bar.
So we could have some fun with that. But anyway, if you'd like to know more about the Alaska cruise, that's on the website as well, and some really good articles and videos for you to watch. And also, of course, don't forget we have our action item, which is there as well. And of course, my commentary today on how much that wall would really cost and whether or not that's exorbitant. We'll talk about some of those issues right after these important messages.
When listeners call in, we never know what they're going to say, and sometimes they shock us, like Jacob did.
We as Christians, we should learn to support ministries like yours that is reaching out and shining light into darkness. This is why Satan has such a great grip on America and the world, is because the world support their own. They will spend billions of dollars to make sure they are heard. The Lord is working a great work through Point of View.
We are thankful for listeners like Jacob and you who become part of our family, a real part, by sacrificing to support the work of Point of View. Take Jacob's words to heart and support us today. Enable us to continue shining God's light into the darkness. We honestly cannot do it without you. Visit pointofview.net. Look for the Donate Now button or call 800-347-5151 or send a gift to Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, of course, we've talked about a couple of things, the millennial view on these issues, but also, of course, we've talked about the immigration executive order signed by President Donald Trump. And, of course, that's just one of many executive orders, many more to come. We'll get into some of the attitudes people have about Christians and Muslims in just a minute. But I thought before we do that, let's go around the round table and talk about some of the resources. And first of all, Nick Pitts, of course, is with the Denison Forum, Director of Cultural Engagement. There is, of course, the Jim Denison letter, if you will, an article. But then also we have put a link today to Nick Pitt's daily briefing, which goes through all sorts of issues. This one here, I love the first one. Monks stored millions of meth pills. I'm going, really? You must work for the Babylonian Bee or the Onion. This has got to be fake news, right? But it's not.
No way. Apparently, what you see in your car every morning is true. Appearances can be deceiving, so don't let the monk deceive you. That is for sure.
But again, just great material. Talk about what's available at the Denison Forum.
So at the Denison Forum, our main product obviously is Jim Denison's phenomenal. Not just it's phenomenal because he signs my checks, just because it's so captivating and it's just a graceful and truthful message that takes a issue from the day and then applies a biblical perspective to that. And that goes out to around 115,000 people in 203 countries. But kind of coupled with that is what my daily briefing. And so the daily briefing just tries to help you, the reader, better understand what are the things what's the news items that are driving the day, as well as what are news items that reveal the spirit of the day as well. So what are those things that are making us cry? What are those things that are making us happy? And then how do you better understand that from a biblical perspective? So it's everything from the monk pills, the monk that was storing those meth pills, to how are we to think through Donald Trump's executive orders, to Elizabeth Warren being silenced by the Senate last night.
Right.
How are we to think through all these things from a biblical perspective?
Yeah, and again, even both of you talked about Lady Gaga and some of that, but again, you have Jim Denison, which I've always felt was just sort of must-read, right up there with Tony Perkins, as well as Gary Bauer. These are things I read every single day, and now I've added to that the Nick Pitt's daily briefing, and all of that's available at denisonforum.org, so you can go to our website and find that link. And Allie, Beth, let's talk about the conservativemillennialblog.com. Now, if you don't want to type all that out, we've just got a link, so all they have to do is click on your picture and they're ready to go.
So you can even Google the Conservative Millennial. Hopefully I'm one of the first people to pop up, but it is the conservativemillennialblog.com, and I just give a take on politics and culture from a conservative millennial perspective. Believe it or not, there really isn't that much out there from a conservative millennial perspective. We're very inundated with the liberal social media, Hollywood, educational institutions. So I kind of just wanted to be a different voice and give conservative millennials a platform. So I've got videos, and then I've also got written posts as well. I also public speak for different issues and causes. Yeah. So like pro-life causes, different organizations, especially down in Austin and around the Dallas area, kind of give me a platform to speak. And so you can go to the conservativemillennialblog.com and you could subscribe there. That'll give you a pretty daily or weekly update on what I'm doing and the content that I'm putting out.
Might just mention, we also have your video there. It's 4 minutes long, and my assignment to our listeners is you might want to go to the video and watch it. It's only going to take you 4 minutes. And at the end, since it's on YouTube, you can click on that share button. You can put it on your Facebook page or your blog or send it to someone. Maybe you have a millennial that maybe needs to hear some of this, and you could send it to him or her. Or, of course, you could also sign them up to get your blog. And so you've made it real easy for people to do that as well. So all of that available on our website today, pointofview.net. And these are two guests that are with us on our conservative, if you will, but especially Millennial Round Table. Let me get to this attitude that people have right now, because the survey, and both Gary Bauer mentioned it, but Thomas Gallatin mentioned it as well. They just did a CBS survey, and they found that essentially almost 2/3 of American voters, 62%, believe that Christians living in the Islamic world are treated unfairly. Now, it's kind of hard to believe it's only 2/3. I would expect it would be 90%, but nevertheless, that's the case. However, 56% of Democrats surveyed believe Muslims living in America are mistreated. So you're in a situation where, and I certainly want to get to the millennial perspective on that, because you cite that out. It's really that you have a real schism between Republicans and Democrats, if you want to look at it that way. And that is, most Americans believe that Christians living in Muslim countries are being mistreated. But you have a high percentage of Democrats believe that Muslims in this country are mistreated. I'm having trouble with this one. Can you explain this at all to me?
I think it's a really good representation of what we as Americans, and I say we just kind of as the general we, think is violence and think it's offensive. So I'm not saying that Muslims are not mistreated, but our version of mistreated might be that their feelings got hurt. I'm not saying that's right, but Muslims in America might get their feelings hurt by a so-called Muslim ban or a travel ban. Christians in Muslim Muslim countries are being killed or being tortured or being persecuted in that sense. So we have a very unique perspective as Americans of what is wrong and what is right. And I think that's a really important distinction and differentiation to make.
And Nick, I'm just thinking you and Jim Denison have both talked about the fact that the places where persecution is taking place the greatest against Christians, 9 of the top 10 countries are all Muslim countries. And of course, the top country is North Korea. So apart from that one, if you will, anomaly about communist North Korea, you can see that it isn't really quite favorable to be a Christian in a Muslim country right now.
No, it's not, and it's very distressing. Just because, again, it's distressing, but it's not surprising, right? So we know the biblical narrative to be true from John 16:33. Jesus reminds us that you will have trouble in this world. Paul reminds a young Timothy in 2 Timothy 3:12 that indeed all who desire to live a godly life will be persecuted. Peter is going to remind his leaders, don't be surprised by the fiery ordeal at which you go through. You know, as Christians, we're always acutely aware of just the what we're signing up for, that God never promised us a comfortable life, but did promise to comfort us in this life. But one of the beautiful things that American Christians can take heart in is the truth that God is redeeming some of this persecution that's happening right now. As what Tertullian, the 2nd century church father, would say, that the blood of the martyrs is the seedbed for the church. And so, yes, there's mistreatment, and yes, there's persecution that's going on, and we should be praying for our brothers and sisters and also seeking to enact policy changes, but we can take heart in the God of the universe is redeeming this in order to grow his church for the glory of his name.
Really incredible stuff as we talk about persecution of Christians, but it also brings us back to something Allie Beth mentioned a minute ago, and that is Robert Knight's been on the program with us many times and wrote earlier in the week in the Washington Times how the left uses violence but decries speech as violence. And if you look at what happened in the University of California at Berkeley, again, I think a lot of those were outside agitators, the so-called black bloc. Okay, I understand that, but still a lot of students went along with that. And so on the one hand, there seemed to be a real tepid response to this. I even posted the other day some of the Twitter feeds from like the mayor of Berkeley and the lieutenant governor of California. And it's kind of like, that's the strongest statement you can make as people are being beaten, pepper sprayed and all the rest. But then one of the women interviewed by a TV station said, we didn't want this man to speak because his words are violent, a form of violence. So we do have this interesting dichotomy, which says, well, if you are representing left-wing ideas, even if a so-called peaceful protest turns violent, well, that's just understandable because of people's anger. But if you say something that hurts my feelings, well, that's violent speech.
Right. And I don't think that we can let them off the hook by saying that they were outside agitators, probably who are breaking windows and setting fire to things, because I haven't seen very many, if any, liberals actually decrying that behavior before we knew that they could be outside agitators. In fact, we had a celebrity, Sarah Silverman is her name. She's a comedian that actually tweeted that if we get the military involved, then we can, knock over Donald Trump. And that's what,
sounds like a military coup.
You're right. Taking down fascism is all about that. So that's the point that they're trying to make. They almost exacerbated it and encouraged it, this kind of violent behavior, even if it wasn't actually the liberal students at the campus. But absolutely, to your point, they are okay with either encouraging or enacting violence if something hurts their feelings. And that's kind of the misprioritization of emotion, I think, and offensive language that we millennials tend to struggle with.
Yeah. Gets back to safe spaces, doesn't it?
Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will break my spirit. Oh, me, oh, my. And so, it's just so fascinating. What's so troubling, I guess, is just the holistic picture of this, right?
Yeah.
That 41% of millennials or 41% of young people believe that the First Amendment is dangerous. It's just this understanding that the college campus is a dangerous place because ideas have consequences. And breaking the misconceptions and the false narratives that you bring into that in order that ignorance might meet wisdom, which is just so distressing that you're going to college in order to further solidify your own viewpoints that are wrong. And so it's just very troubling that you can't have an open exchange of ideas, because it reminds us, if we go back to what the founders would say, right? What George Washington said, if you take away free speech, we will be like lamb led to the slaughter, right? It's this understanding that free speech, yes, it is. It's a very dangerous thing, but it's in that dangerous thing that it creates this palpable energy that we can be better than we are now. And right now we're not.
We'll take a break, and when we come back, we'll take some of your phone calls. 1-800-351-1212. Millennial Round Table, Nick Pitts, Allie Beth Stuckey. We'll take your calls right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. A lawsuit against an Indiana sheriff that refused to supply its Muslim inmates with a halal diet has been dismissed. A halal diet eliminates pork products and includes other meat only if it has been slaughtered following certain religious conditions. After the ACLU filed its suit in 2016, the sheriff has agreed to provide the halal diet to the inmates. The case is interesting on a number of levels. First, it's an important reminder that religious liberty extends to those who, through crime, have forfeited much of their individual liberty. Religious liberty is a human right that only our Creator should alter. Second, the lawsuit was premised upon the Indiana Religious Freedom Restoration Act. You may recall the nationwide controversy surrounding Indiana's RFRA and the sky is falling protest that came with it. Yet it has been used exactly as it should have been used, to prevent a county official from substantially burdening the free exercise of religion by an Indianan. And finally, it's important to note that without the Indiana RFRA, this case may have never even been brought. In 1997, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled that the federal RFRA protections are not enforceable against state or local government agents like a county sheriff. So without a state RFRA, this inmate's religious liberty may have been left unprotected. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. Some people think our religious freedom will soon be gone, but that's not true. The fact is that First Liberty, a national network of America's top attorneys, is winning over 90% of our cases. We defend religious freedom for people like you. Go to firstliberty.org and read the exciting story. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
I'd like to join the conversation today, 1-800-351-1212. It is the Millennial Round Table, and let's go to the phones in South Carolina first. WAGP and Dennis, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hello, thank you for taking my call. I think about this a lot. I think about where people get their ideas from. And there's almost like a religious fervor to the left's response to Donald Trump. They believe he's like the devil himself, the way they act. And I feel like this is a part and parcel of humanism and, you know, the education that has been the main thinking behind our educators is humanistic thinking. And it's like we were born as a country believing in the inalienable rights given to us by God. But now it's the rights given to us by government. And I just think that's got something to do with what's going on. It feels like the Civil War is brewing right now.
Sure.
And I just wonder if you could speak to that.
Certainly. And, you know, one of the things I'd say is, you know, first of all, we'll talk about this more in the second hour when we look at the demographics of millennials, but more millennials have gone to college than any generation. If you look at those who even have a degree by the age of 25, a higher percentage than even the baby boomers. So first of all, more of them have been exposed to universities, which sometimes are teaching some of those ideas. And then second of all, we've moved from this idea that all men are created equal, that are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, that those rights come from God instead. now the idea of government is the one that gives us rights. What about this?
Yeah, it's fascinating. So I guess to go back to Animal Farm, right? So if we go back to Animal Farm, we're all created equal. I'm just more equal than you. And so it's just such a fascinating twist that we've kind of moved towards. And so I think you're right in that the culture is, from a Christian perspective, we would say is discipling us. I think we're all being discipled to some form or fashion. Scott Sauls in his book, Jesus Outside the Lines, really spells this out pretty well. And I think I agree with that. To a large degree, we are being shaped and formed by our forces outside of us. And I think that's why the scriptures would be so careful to be able to admonish us in 1 Corinthians 15:33, this idea of bad company will corrupt good morals. We've always known that there's been forces outside of us that shape us. But like you said, Kerby, there's just more millennials that are going to the to colleges. And as Nicholas Kristof, a liberal, has been very upfront about, is that there very much is a supremacy to liberalism in the college campus and how that's shaping and forming college students, which is just, it's less than desired if you're, then you want to have an open space by which truth can be combated and not necessarily truth can be shoved down your throat.
I just mentioned we did an interview with Scott Sauls on that book, so you can actually do a search and find that. But, you also see, for example, Allie, Beth, that in Romans 12 and other passages, it tells us not to be conformed to this culture. Colossians 2:8 says that we should not be taken captive by false philosophy. But if you go to university and you don't know what you believe, those philosophies there are, again, philosophies of humanism and atheism, and it's easy for a lot of Christian kids to kind of imbibe deeply from some of those ideas.
Right. It's getting more and more difficult to not be conformed to the pattern of this world. And I think God knew that. And that's why he followed up with but renew yourself in the spirit of your mind. It takes work and it takes action to not be conformed to the pattern of this world. And I think millennials that are going into college have that challenge, perhaps more than ever. I know even going to a Southeastern school that is quote unquote conservative, there was definitely animosity towards hardline conservative or real Christian views on what is right and what is wrong. This whole idea of moral relativity has really been pushed forward by liberals, which is interesting because they will also say in the same breath that their view of morality and what is right and wrong is correct and yours isn't. So unless you believe objectively in my subjective opinion, then you are wrong. And I think that's what we're seeing professors do and put forth. And it's like Nick was saying, it's not creating a space for critical thinking or deductive reasoning. It's creating a space to where you're getting your perhaps wrong ideas reinforced, and then after that you're almost a lost cause.
Yeah, it's not an educational space, or it should be an educational space, not an indoctrinating space, right? So it's not necessarily we want to favor the right, we don't want to favor the left, we just want it to be an open space. So like what John Milton says in Paradise Lost, right? Let her and falsehood grapple in a field, for I've never known truth to be put asunder. Let's just combat these ideas, because all ideas are equal, but then to be able to test them out, the implications of that. And I think what we continue to see and what we find to be true is that when conservative ideals are tested out into the marketplace of the real world, they're proven to be good and beneficial and right. And why not champion those in the areas?
I think what catches many college students off guard is they hear what could be called postmodernism. You have your view of truth and I have my view of truth. You have a different view of truth, or moral relativism. You have your set of values, I have my set of values, someone else has a different set of values. And so they think, well, that sounds really open-minded, but really what it is only one set of values are allowed in the public arena. Only one set of values are allowed in this classroom. Only one set of values are allowed in this political discourse. That's the problem.
Yeah, it's just intellectually dishonest, right? Because in the name of tolerance, they're forcing, they're being intolerant. And so it's just intellectually dishonest, one. And then two, we have to have a common set of principles by which we can come together, right? And so that you have your truth, I have my truth, and there's no such. Well, that's not conducive to anything. Then we're just like scattered sheep that are going every which way, and we can never be united around a common set of ideals with that.
And everybody really does have their absolutes. I remember one time a student said to me, there is no absolute truth. And I said, do you believe that? And he said, oh, yeah, absolutely. And I said, well, let's just think about this. Right. You just told me that you absolutely believe there's no absolute truth, except the absolute truth, there is no absolute truth. And he smiled and said, okay, you got me on that. I said, no, I'm not playing word games. What the point is, something has to be your authority, your standard. It may be you, it may be your professor, it may be your parents, it may be the Bible, it may be God's word, it may be the writings of Karl Marx. Something ultimately is your value. And right now, Allie, Beth, we have a lot of people, even in the university, that pretend like I'm really open-minded, but you find how quickly that open mind becomes really shut when you begin to present an idea that I don't like or disagree with in one way or another.
Right, and that's kind of the liberal shtick, is that they are tolerant and inclusive and accepting and loving and compassionate. They use all of these universally positive terms, so that if you're on the outside looking in, you're going to say, well, they're on the right side of history. They're compassionate. They're tolerant. They're inclusive. I don't want to be exclusive.
Yeah.
I don't want to be hateful. But really what they've actually done is thwarted the definitions of those words to fit their cause, rather than changing their cause to fit the actual definitions of those words. And so what you have is people who have declared that they are true, that they are right, by latching on to these positive words and changing the definitions of them. And in doing, have really actually expressed their intolerance and their exclusivity towards any opinion that is outside of theirs. So if you disagree with them, you're not compassionate, you're not tolerant, and you're not accepting. And exactly what you said, that's actually a paradox of what those words really mean.
So for the Christian perspective, right? So it literally, this is an irrational position to hold. And so how do you so for the practical person, how do you out-argue someone that's acting irrationally? Well, then you just have to prove the truth of your claims through your actions. And so if you're a Christian perspective, yes, they're not going to believe your words, and that's where your deeds have to come in, to be able to show the irrationality of their claims by the deeds that you can show.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we're going to spend a little bit of time just talking about who millennials are. We've never really had a chance to have both of you in studio. How many are there? What do they believe? Or how many are married? How many have college degrees? Those kinds of basics, as well as just give you a chance to understand a little bit more about the millennial generation. That's what we want to do here on our Millennial Round Table. And as we go to our break, let me just mention we have Nick Pitt's daily briefing that will take you to the denisonforum.org. We have some material by Allie, Beth, which will take you to the conservativemillennialblog.com. And then we've posted one article, 30 millennial demographics you need to know about. So we'll be quoting from some of that and, of course, welcoming your phone calls. All of it available at our website, pointofview.net. That's where you can find those articles and also the action item for you today. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
Why does Kerby Anderson do what he does? Because he believes in God's ability to use you to make a difference.
There's a real need for us to articulate a responsible biblical perspective and to give people an understanding of what is happening in the world, and in addition to educating them, to then empower them to go out and make a difference for Christ.
Together we can push back the growing darkness. It's not going to be easy. But by God's grace, it is happening, one person, one community at a time. Join us in this mission. Become a monthly partner. $1 a day, $30 a month will make a huge difference. Or perhaps you can do $100 a month. We need partners of all sizes. We need you. Give today online at pointofview.net. At the top of the page, next to the Donate Now button, click on Become a Monthly Partner. Pointofview.net. Mail your donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, or call 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour, thank you for joining us today. We're going to spend some time talking about the millennial generation because it is our Millennial Round Table. Certainly any of the questions that we raised in the first hour are certainly fair game, but for those of you that are just joining us, we have in studio with us Nick Pitts with, again, the Denison Forum, Allie, Beth, Stuckey with, of course, Conservative Millennial. But I wanted to pull some facts and figures out. We posted some of the articles that have been very influential in understanding the millennial generation, but I thought we would talk about who they are and how they are certainly going to be a very important force in the future. If you want to start a debate, you can start it by saying, how many millennials are there? Because there's a debate as to whether or not I start in 1980 to 2000. If that's the case, you come up with about 78 million millennials, but you could get different numbers. I've had some people start in 1982 to 1990, 2000. Everybody comes around different ones. At least the one we posted here said 77 million millennials between 18 and 36, comprising 24% of the population. And so that is the biggest demographic we've ever had, and about 2/3 of them born in the United States. But let me go around the round table. Allie, Beth, let's have you maybe add a few other facts and figures about the millennial generation. What have you learned?
Well, just from my own experience as a millennial and just from observations that I've seen from my peers and my coworkers, we're a very feelings-based generation, and that's not really a fact or a figure. That's just a feeling that I have.
Sure.
We feel certain ways. We say it in what we feel. We say, I feel that something is like this, rather than looking at facts and figures and numbers. Emotions are a very high priority for us, and that's good because we can be very inclusive and compassionate, but it's also bad because we also get our feelings hurt very quickly. So things like freedom, liberty, what's actually right and wrong are actually lower on the priority list than how we feel.
Yes. Again, probably the most educated generation in American history because, as I mentioned in the first hour, but let's mention it again, already 23% of millennials have a bachelor's degree or higher. Nick, we can have a debate as to whether or not having a college degree makes you educated, but nevertheless, if you look at those individuals, and this comes from the work by Tom and Jess Rayner, which I might just mention, this book called The Millennials, which is really one of the still the best books out there, is looking at those who by the age of 25 have a college degree, highest percentage in American history, and so much more educated in the sense of being exposed to an academic environment, and that's very important to understand about the millennial generation.
I am millennial, hear me complain, or hear me protest, I guess I should say. So we are a student debt accumulating, selfie taking, Uber riding generation, and so we very much are individuals that are inclined towards education. And growing up, but personally with my own, I never knew a world where I wasn't going to go to college. It was just always just kind of something.
But
that
your
was
grandparents didn't go to college, right?
Yeah, grandparents went to school when he was, I believe, potentially going to get a PhD degree here in a couple of months. And so we'll see what that looks like. But one of the interesting things is that we are one of the most educated generations. But coupled with that, we're also a job hopping generation.
Yes, there we go. I wanted to get to that one next.
Millennials are going to hold a job before the age of 30. For an average of 16 months, they're going to go through 7 jobs before the age of 30. And so one of the interesting things that we're seeing is that they really are believing that they can change the world. They can do anything they set their mind to. And that when they don't experience that ability to change or voice heard at a particular organization, they're going to move on. They very much capture what Dr. Martin Luther King would say is feeling the urgency of now. And so they're going to go wherever that they feel as though that their skill set as well as their vision can be implemented at that particular footprint of that organization.
You know, that survey I mentioned by Tom and Jess Rayner was the Lifeway survey. They ask millennials, do you agree with this statement? I think that I can do something great. And almost 90% said yes. Now, Beth, I guess that makes sense if it's a generation where everybody got a trophy in the soccer team and everybody does well and gets high grades. But that leads to the possibility of later on being very disappointed about life, doesn't it?
Right. We're very individualistic. So not only does everyone get a trophy, but somehow in that we also believe that all of us are special. And of course, if all of us are special, then no one's special.
Hold on. I need to process that for a second. I'm not special? Is that what's happening right now?
I know.
Oh, my goodness.
I know. It's a difficult thing to grasp,
So good.
but the first time you probably do grasp it is when you graduate either from high school or from college, depending on the time that you went into your first job. So exactly like Nick, I never thought I wasn't going to go to college. When I graduated from high school, I thought I knew everything. Went into college, realized I really didn't. I didn't know anything, and that was a shock to me. Then I graduated college and realized that I still didn't know anything. So I went into my first job thinking that I was going to change the world, that I was going to get promoted just like that. I found out very quickly that PR was a lot harder than I thought it was going to be. Got that reality check. Thankfully for me, that gave me a very good, humbling life lesson, that it takes hard work to get to where you want to go. And unfortunately, I don't think for whatever reason, every millennial that goes into their first job, gains that lesson for whatever reason.
Yeah, I think you're right on. So yes, we do graduate college at a higher degree than previous generations. But let's think about men of old, right? So Socrates would say that he was the smartest person in the world because he recognized that he didn't know everything. Mm-hmm. That Aristotle would say that the mark of an educated mind is to be able to entertain two thoughts and not accept either. And as we're seeing played out on college campuses, even though they're places of education, Aristotle would probably beg to differ based upon that quote and based upon Socrates. But so it's just interesting because there's the humility that's lacking and the teachableness, though they are entering into classrooms. There's just not a humble posture that receives teaching very well, but rather just wants to be patted on the back. And when you brought up participation trophies with soccer, it brought back bad memories. Bad memories. I did not have a good soccer experience and eventually would call it communist kickball. So we'll just leave it at that. So
one thing you mentioned just before we go to a break, and let me maybe get into it more after the break, is the job hopping. And there was a study done the other day that said that millennials will have 12 to 15 jobs by the time they retire. And I thought that number's low in light of the number you just gave us a minute ago. And so let's just use the 12 to 15 number, which I think is much too low. That means that you would have 12 to 15 different jobs, but it also gets back to something political we've talked about. You'd have 12 to 15 different medical plans, because when we start talking about the issue of the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare as it's also called, you don't have portability. You know, your company doesn't own your health insurance policy, your car insurance policy, your house insurance policy, but it owns your medical insurance policy. So the millennials, I think, might bring about a revolution in saying, this is nuts that every time I change a job, I've got to get a different policy. And so as we are in the midst of having a debate as to whether or not there will be repeal and replace, I want people to understand that we're not just talking about millennials in the abstract. It has some what we're talking about every day here on Point of View.
This is one to think about. Some of the largest organizations that are employing people right now weren't even around 20 years ago. The Googles and the Facebooks and some of these, it just is a drastically changing. And then enter into that, it's only going to continue to change as it grows more efficient relative to the usage of artificial intelligence. And so what is it going to look like? It's going to require millennials specifically to be teachable as well as to continue to seek training as they move into their job careers.
We'll talk about that job hopping. I also want to get into what about multiculturalism, because this survey shows that more than 7 out of 10 millennials appreciate the influence of other cultures on the American way of life. What about those thoughts? We've got a lot more to cover. We'll do so right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, critics of President Donald Trump's wall say that it is too expensive. And I think this criticism provides a great opportunity to remind people how much money the federal government spends. So let's take a moment and look at what such a wall might cost and compare it to other items in the federal budget. When I was on the radio the other day, I reminded my audience that the federal budget last year was $3.8 trillion. If you divide that amount by 365 days in the year, you will find that each day the federal government spends about $10.4 billion. Some have estimated that the wall President Trump is proposing might cost about $12 to $15 billion, which would probably be spread over about 2 to 3 years. The total cost of the wall over that period of time equals about 1.5 days of the federal operating cost. Jeff Poor wrote a column recently about questionable federal government expenditures that exceed Trump's wall. A Government Accountability Office report estimated in 2014 that the federal government made $59 billion in improper Medicare payments and $17 billion in improper Medicaid payments. The total of $76 billion would be roughly the cost of 5 border walls. The Lockheed Martin F-35 stealth fighter jet projects cost an estimated $379 billion. That would be roughly the cost of 25 border walls. The Earned Income Tax Credit provides $69 billion in benefits to 28 million households. And while we're talking about poverty, consider the cost of the more than the 50-year war on poverty. Taxpayers have footed a bill for $22 trillion, which would be 1,466 border walls. Once you put the cost of a wall in context, you can begin to see that it wouldn't be one of the largest expenditures in the federal government. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let's open up the phones and give you a chance to maybe ask a question or make a comment about the millennial generation. We usually are talking about those born between 1980 and 2000, and usually the number is 77, 78 million, something like that. And we've given you a little bit of the statistics, but we're going to certainly work our way through a few more. But Allie, Beth, let me get to you for just a minute. Job hopping. That's just the way it is. And even if it wasn't a trend in the millennial generation, it's a trend in the culture. And I think that's going to affect some things like is employee disability, the Affordable Care Act, and others, because there used to be, in my generation, especially my parents' generation, you work for General Motors will take care of you. That's not the case anymore. A lot of people are changing jobs pretty frequently, aren't they?
Right. There's not as much reliability as among millennials. And Nick kind of touched on this earlier. It's because we're constantly seeking that job that gives us purpose outside of ourselves. So it kind of used to be, I know my dad worked for the same company for a very long time. That's just kind of what you did. His purpose was providing. Mm-hmm. For us, we're looking for something outside of just provision and just money. Part of that is good, but part of that is bad because, like you said, it affects things that we're not thinking about. We're not as reliable. People maybe aren't quite as apt to hire a millennial knowing just the high turnover. And then on the other hand, some people are okay with that because we work hard for you for a year and then we're out.
Yeah, I think that point that touches on something because there is a greater emphasis upon work than there ever has been in previous generations because we're seeking meaning, we're seeking purpose through work. And whereas in previous generations, much of that was found in church organizations and local community organizations. So as Robert Putnam would say, we are now bowling alone, that there are individuals that We're not joining bowling leagues. We're not being civically engaged because we're placing a significant amount of emphasis upon our jobs in order to give us the meaning and purpose that often has been found outside of work, but now is inside of work.
Let's talk about alone for just a minute. 21% of millennials are married, and it isn't just marriage, but the average age, or the median age, if I want to be precise, if you look at the U.S. Census statistics, are that millennials are marrying 5 years later, both for men, and 5 years later for women. So you have this extended period of time of singleness, and that's a different kind of mindset. Allie, Beth, speak to that for just a minute, because it used to be that churches would maybe have a singles group, but it was just really the kids out of college that hadn't gotten married yet. But now you have a level of singleness that is so much longer than any time we've ever seen in American history.
Mm-hmm. We are kind of commitment folks, so we like to defer that responsibility as much as possible. And I don't want to speak for all millennials. I'm married. I got married at 23. I was the only one among my friends to do that.
I bet you were.
Very first by a long shot.
Yes.
And I'm totally okay with that. And I'm not speaking badly about my friends who are kind of deferring that. That's totally fine. It's just a mindset that I'm not quite ready to settle down because I have all of these things that I want to accomplish, that I want to do, all of this influence that I want to gain. And our culture has kind of painted marriage as this jail that you go into and all of your dreams die when you get there. And I think it's important to kind of restructure our idea of that for millennials, that marriage isn't something where, it's not the death of your dreams and the death of your pursuits.
Yeah. And so I would be one of those that is single. So I guess we're representative of this. And so they're very much. I think
more of you than of her.
Yeah, exactly. So what's interesting, I think, with millennials is that there's just this impetus and there's this desire to change the world. And kind of like what Allie Beth spoke to, increasingly the culture has defined marriage as kind of like a ball and chain. It's something that hinders you. It keeps you back. And so millennials increasingly are wanting to change the world. And one of the ways that they change the world, they believe they change the world, is just being single in that nature. And so one of what the Bible would say is that the marital covenant has the potential for God to be able to use that to sanctify you two. But one of the interesting things I think we're seeing with millennials is that they are moving in such a way that allows them to just kind of press forward without the other individual there. And so I can speak for myself. I think Bloomberg really said it well, is I want to put my life together to such an extent, then I bring somebody in. So millennials are much less prone to be able to marry earlier, but they're going to buy a house earlier. And so that they can, again, creating those components necessary to be able to invite somebody in. I think you can make arguments on both ways, but it's just another.
What about the issue of divorce? Because it seems to me that millennials have seen the divorce rate in a way that was up front and center. That is, the divorce rate in America from about 1969 to 1981 essentially doubled almost overnight. And so divorce went from being rare to routine. And is it possible, Allie Beth, that some of that phobia towards marriage is, I've seen enough divorce, if not in my own parents' life, in the life of my friends' life, and that makes me really hesitant to get married as well.
Absolutely. I think people fear that. They'd rather go through a breakup than they would divorce. I think anyone would. And I think another part of that, too, is that many millennials, especially outside of the church, are enjoying the so-called privileges of marriage, probably before marriage. And they probably don't even see them as privileges anymore. It's, well, I can live together. We can basically share a life without the fear of divorce. Why would I need a piece of paper or a ceremony or spend all this money
you got it.
and change that? Of course, for Bible-believing Christians, that's a little bit different. And so I think that's probably part of it, is why would I go through a divorce if I never have to get married in the first place?
It's so fascinating. Yeah, cohabitation rates are at 400% over the past 50 years. It is absolutely fascinating how many individuals are not going after the paper. I can't remember his name, New York Times columnist. So New York Times columnist has even coined this term of monogamish now. Yeah. And so it's not necessarily, it's kind of a justification for unfaithfulness. But what's even so fascinating is that divorce has become normalized in our culture today, to the extent that an article was put out in the London Times yesterday talking about the divorce selfie. So hashtag divorce selfie it's communicating to friends from both parties that the divorce is happening, yes, but we're happy with each other. We're still good with each other.
Wow.
And just how interesting this is
Change
now.
the nature of divorce, of marriage.
And you know, if I'm going to be a true millennial, I'm going to project my experience out into the larger world. I would say that even from my own Facebook friends that I have, I've seen pictures where individuals are celebrating their divorce. They're having divorce parties, and they're trying not just normalizing it, but just celebrating it, which is just very unfortunate.
Well, I think it's also interesting too. You said that cohabitation rates are up by 400%, but also the divorce rate has doubled. So I think that speaks to that innate, inherent desire in the human heart to be one with someone else and for that companionship. That hasn't changed. It's the commitment and the covenant that comes along with marriage that people are scared of, but they're still seeking that love and they're still seeking that togetherness. It's just the quote unquote rules that surround that covenant they don't like.
Still want Jerry Maguire, you complete me.
You
they
complete
still
me.
want
Yes.
that line.
Yes.
You know, this Millennials book, which I mentioned before, they did the Lifeway survey and found that 60% of millennials said that they would live together before married. And the argument is oftentimes, well, you wouldn't buy a pair of shoes without trying them on. You wouldn't buy a car without a test drive. And I always like to say, yeah, but if you don't decide to buy the car, there are no emotional feelings that the car has. You don't end up leaving your junk in the trunk of the car, and you don't affect the car in some various ways. But again, that's part of that kind of pragmatism that's part of the millennial generation, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And even just to that metaphor, no, you wouldn't buy a car without test driving it, but that's what dating is for. You don't actually have to take the car home and live with the car in order to know that you want to buy the car. I think that would be kind of crazy. There are consequences to that, right?
And humans are not cars. Let's
So,
just say, there was the Pixar movie Cars.
Yes,
Now, granted,
right.
the Rascal Flatts song killed me on that, but I think this even points to something even greater. I think Modern Romance is a book that came out by Aziz Ansari and another social scientist, and it speaks to this because there used to be a previous generation that recognized they needed one another.
Right.
That they weren't relying on their parents. They needed one another for basic necessities, so they got together. And when they got together and performed those actions of love, eventually the feelings of love came about. Now we have a millennial generation that are getting together, and they still don't have those. Those needs are still being provided by their family, and so they don't need each other. So they just expect the feelings to be there. And when the feelings, so whereas a previous generation expected the feelings to come later on during the marriage, now we have millennials that want the feelings to be there immediately. When it's just not happening.
Yeah. Well, again, just anticipation and maybe even a little less willing to forego current consumption and all the other things that we talk about. Allie, Beth, I know you need to go, and I'm looking forward to other opportunities. But let's mention real quickly that if somebody would like to either contact you to have you come and speak, or would like to receive your Conservative Millennial blog, it's theconservativemillennialblog.com. But you don't have to remember all that. Just click on the button there. That's available to them. And you also have a Facebook page. Where can they find you?
Yeah, so if you just type in on Facebook, the Conservative Millennial blog, or just the Conservative Millennial, I should be the first one to pop up. My email is Allie at theconservativemillennialblog.com. A lot to type, but that's where you'll reach me. You can always send me a message on Facebook. I'm very responsive to that. So for public speaking engagements, or just to talk to me about any issues that we've got going on, what you think about conservative millennialism, I'm open to that.
I might just mention, next to your picture, we do have a link to Facebook and Twitter so people can find you there. I know you have to run off. We'll see you next Wednesday, maybe.
Thank you.
And Nick, we have a lot more to talk about, but we also would like to take some phone calls. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
When listeners call in, we never know what they're going to say, and sometimes they shock us, like Jacob did.
We as Christians, we should learn to support ministries like yours that is reaching out and shining light into darkness. This is why Satan has such a great grip on America and the world, is because the world support their own. They will spend billions of dollars to make sure they are heard. The Lord is working a great work through Point of View.
We are thankful for listeners like Jacob and you who become part of our family, a real part, by sacrificing to support the work of Point of View. Take Jacob's words to heart and support us today. Enable us to continue shining God's light into the darkness. We honestly cannot do it without you. Visit pointofview.net. look for the Donate Now button or call 800-347-5151 or send a gift to Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, it is part of our Millennial Round Table. Last half hour, we still have in studio with us Nick Pitts, and would love to get your comments. 1-800-351-1212. This issue of cohabitation is certainly one. In terms of divorce, cohabitation have really redefined marriage. But let me come to something else that you and Jim Denison have talked about. Also, the redefinition of marriage because of same-sex marriage. And millennials account for about 1/5 already of same-sex couples. So a very different view about marriage in terms of commitment, in terms of whether or not you would be married, in terms of whether you'd live together before marriage, but also different in terms of the fact that marriage is in some cases being redefined by the millennial generation.
Yeah. I think you're hitting on a right point in the sense that we have to first let's talk about it from a biblical perspective, and that marriage is this beautiful. It's a earthly reality of a heavenly glory. Right. What Paul's going to say in Ephesians 5, it's this beautiful mystery of the relationship between Christ and His church. And so when you're talking about redefining what marriage is, you're really seeking to re-alter the character of who God is and how He relates to His church, which is just very treacherous kind of landscaping. And then we've just allowed this narrative to be put forward here in our culture today that homosexuals can't marry. Well, that's just not the case. They can marry. They just have to marry someone that's the opposite sex. So it's just unfortunate how that narrative has just been trumped for this other false narrative in the political sphere. But then what we're seeing is just so kind of unfortunate, I guess you could say, and even just tragic, is it's not just millennials that have favorable views towards same-sex marriage, but it's evangelical millennials as well.
Right.
They're the majority of and I can't remember the statistic. Last statistic I remember seeing is 62% of evangelical millennials believe in same-sex marriage, which again is just, you expect a lost person to believe and act like a lost person, but for a saint to do that, it's just very troubling.
Let's get into that, and some of that we will cover next week, because we're going to do a millennial round table with a number of evangelicals, and Jarrett Stevens will be here, you'll be here, and I'll see if we can get Allie, Beth, Stuckey back here about just the whole question of why millennials don't come to church, or when they do come to church, whether they believe what the church teaches. But you have this interesting dichotomy that people have trouble sorting out, because your generation, the millennial generation, is perhaps the most pro-life generation in American history. But on the other hand, it is a generation that has been much more accepting of homosexual marriage or same-sex marriage. Now, I think it has less to do with them looking at it biblically, as you just illustrated, but seeing it as sort of a justice issue. On the one hand, it's unjust to kill a baby in the womb. And as a matter of fact, I look around and I see some individuals that aren't in my classroom because somebody aborted them. And on the other hand, it's a justice issue. Well, it just doesn't seem right for me to say that two individuals, even if they're of the same sex, they shouldn't be allowed to marry one another. So is it a justice issue that causes that dichotomy? What's your thoughts?
Yeah, it's a justice issue, one, and then I think there's two things that are at work here. The millennials have always had just a strong significance and premium that they placed on relationships.
Yes.
They've grown up in a world in which divorce has just been prevalent. They've known people that have gone off overseas. They're intimately acquainted with brokenness in this world, and so they tend to put a premium on relationships. I'm experiencing that within my own checkbook because I've gone away. I've gone away from Tennessee, where I'm from, and I live in Texas. But I have so many of my friends that want to get married, and it's just expected for you to fly back to go see them get married, to fly back to bachelor parties, to fly back to all these things. And so, and what you're increasingly seeing is that millennials value not pay raises, but more time off with their employers. And so there's just a premium on relationships, one. And then I think a second thing is you just have a misunderstanding of what good is. That good is only that which brings me instant gratification from a millennial perspective, when we know from reality is that good sometimes doesn't always bring me instant gratification. I think Jesus has done significant work in this when he says in Matthew 13:44 that the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field, which a man finds, goes and hides again, and then for joy sells everything that he has in order to go purchase the field. There's going to be some sting when he lets go of what he previously owned, but he knows that sting is going to be wore away by the joy and the treasure that he's going to have in that. And I think from the Christian perspective, It's understanding that good is that which brings me closer to God. And when you're in kind of the same-sex marriage and some of this other sin, it really separates us from God, from experiencing the joy to be found complete in Christ Jesus. And so we just have a misunderstanding of what good is today.
Yeah, very good. Again, on those relationships, another point that I thought I would get into in our survey that we posted today, 3/4 of millennials have made a financial donation to a not-for-profit organization. 71% have raised money for a not-for-profit organization. 57% of millennials have volunteered for a not-for-profit organization. Let me talk about millennials in general and then evangelical millennials. And millennials in general still tend to say, I want to see something significant with my dollars. In other words, I am more inclined to go and help build Habitat for Humanity, or to actually work at a soup kitchen, or to see my dollars having an impact. And then even for Christians, I'm more inclined to go on short-term missions to see whether or not my dollars going to missions are actually going to be working. So whether you look at the secular millennials or the Christian millennials, your generation more than anybody else wants to roll up your sleeves and get involved, right?
They very much want to channel to what Jeremiah is going to say in Jeremiah 29:7, to work for the good of their city, to work for the welfare of their city. And so what we see is a previous generation, so we'll use my grandparents, for example. My grandparents, whenever they would move, if they did move, the first thing that they would do on that Sunday is to go find the local Baptist church, and then they would join the church. Well, millennials, it's very different. I did college ministry for a couple of years, and what we see with millennials is when they move, when they make that transition for college, what they're doing is they're not going to join the church, but they're going to begin to church hop, and they're going to be able to church question. So one of the things that they're looking for is this church presence going to be felt if it's gone? Is this church making a local impact as well as making a global impact? They're going to spend a number of Sundays working at the church, working their way into the church to figure out the DNA of the church, if it's working for the welfare of the city. And then once they figure that out, then they're ready to join. Whereas a previous generation is just going to join. Millennials are going to go to the service, they're going to go to church, but they're not going to join the church until later.
In some respects, we're giving a preview next week, but that's okay, because it seems to me that also answers a question that a lot of pastors listening to this program right now are thinking about. Elders and deacons are wondering as well. And that is, why is it that we do seem to have some millennials come in and they're here for a few weeks, but then they're gone. There's something that doesn't keep them there. Or even the website, they visit it, but it's not a sticky website. They don't stay there. So what are they looking for that the churches oftentimes are not providing?
Yeah, so there are two things that they're looking for, I would say. One, they're looking for that common good that we just talked about. Right. They're looking to make sure that they're making a tangible difference on the community as well as the world that they're working towards, that they're not just teaching about the love of Jesus, but they're showing the love of Jesus. And then I think the second thing that they're looking for is connections. That we are the most connected generation in the world, but we're the most isolated generation in the world because we have an inadequate understanding of what community is. And so but again, this isn't anything new. So just like what Paul was going to tell a young Timothy about Lois and Eunice, the older generations are of great value to millennials. The number one person that millennials are looking up to is their grandparents. They desire those connections with individuals that have walked where they've walked and lived to tell the story and can offer that advice to what Paul would say, and trust that faithful message to a faithful messenger. And they're looking for those connections within the church because they want to be a part of something bigger than themselves.
Again, that came out in the Lifeway survey, which we'll talk more about next week, in which they found that connection to family much more important than baby boomers who took off to college and said, see ya. They are connected now through Facebook and things like that. And so in some respects, that's old news. But what about the new news? Because your generation has been more media bombarded than any generation, and you're also perhaps the most educated generation. So let's talk about that for just a minute. You go to a church website and it's kind of clunky and it doesn't look inviting. They may not even walk in the door. Or if even it does pretty well on the website and they walk in and it's kind of boring and one person's speaking and there's no visuals and it doesn't help me connect with the church, that's a pretty quick way to drive a millennial out the door, isn't it?
Completely agree. So what millennials, they have knowledge, but they don't have understanding. And so there has to be a distinction that has to be made. And I think Henry Kissinger has done this really well when he says that we are the most connected generation, but we also have the most access to understanding. But because we have that access, it keeps us from internalizing that understanding in order that we might gain that understanding rather. So we have access to the knowledge, but it's only when you internalize it that you really create that understanding. And then the second thing that millennials are looking for is it's not creativity, it's authenticity. They're not looking for some light shows. They're not looking for the smoke and mirrors. What they're looking for is an authentic experience.
Right.
And what we see with Jesus is he is the one that was premier in offering a authentic experience for individuals to come and to follow after me, to deny yourself and to follow after him wherever he may be leading.
We'll take a break. Let's take some phone calls. And, of course, we are privileged to have in studio with us for a few more minutes Nick Pitts. And, of course, also heard us promoting next Wednesday's program. We're going to spend a fair amount of time talking about why millennials aren't in the church, or what are some of the issues that they are dealing with theologically. I think you're going to find that to be a very good program. And, again, we have some links today to some of the facts and figures. If they've come a little fast, we have this 30 millennial demographics you need, as well as a link to Nick Pitt's daily briefing. It's all at our website, pointofview.net. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. A lawsuit against an Indiana sheriff that refused to supply its Muslim inmates with a halal diet has been dismissed. A halal diet eliminates pork products and includes other meat only if it has been slaughtered following certain religious conditions. After the ACLU filed its suit in 2016, the sheriff has agreed to provide the halal diet to the inmates. The case is interesting on a number of levels. First, it's an important reminder that religious liberty extends to those who, through crime, have forfeited much of their individual liberty. Religious liberty is a human right that only our Creator should alter. Second, the lawsuit was premised upon the Indiana Religious Freedom Restoration Act. You may recall the nationwide controversy surrounding Indiana's RFRA and the sky is falling protest that came with it. Yet it has been used exactly as it should have been used, to prevent a county official from substantially burdening the free exercise of religion by an Indianan. And finally, it's important to note that without the Indiana RFRA, this case may have never even been brought. In 1997, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled that the federal RFRA protections are not enforceable against state or local government agents like a county sheriff. So without a state RFRA, this inmate's religious liberty may have been left unprotected. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. Some people think our religious freedom will soon be gone, but that's not true. The fact is that First Liberty, a national network of America's top attorneys, is winning over 90% of our cases. We defend religious freedom for people like you. Go to firstliberty.org and read the exciting story. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Millennial Round Table today. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Let's go to Kentucky first. Charles, thank you for joining our conversation.
How you doing there today?
Good. I'd love to hear from you.
Well, I'm not a millennial, but I was at one time.
Yeah, that qualifies.
Long time, even before I became a Christian, my attitude was this, that if a girl's good enough to live with, she's good enough to marry. And so I got married instead of
cohabitation.
Right.
And we went from a time, as he points out, that cohabitation was very rare, just a few percentage points back in the 1950s, to a 400% increase in cohabitation now, where about 60% of millennials say they'll live together before marriage, which, as we know from some statistics, will increase your divorce rate by an additional 50%. So there are wisdom in following some of those biblical admonitions, don't you think?
Yes, and a lot of times, I think one of the problems is the fact that churches don't emphasize the fact that marriage, is worth more than just a little bit of pleasure you might get by having, cohabitating.
Sure. And one of the reasons I put a chapter in my book on Christian ethics on cohabitation is I was running into, as I was teaching at Dallas Seminary and some other places, pastors who would say, I will go to a couple that's living together inside our church, that are members of our church, and give them the Bible verses that are appropriate to this. And they would look up and say, okay, well, I know what the Bible says, but are there any other reasons why we shouldn't live together? And I said, well, yeah, there's all sorts of very good reasons. So in addition to the biblical passage, I do the common sense, common grace arguments. And this is the problem we have today, is, as Nick points out. Nick, speak to that for just a minute. You just have a lot of evangelical millennials that when they look at cohabitation, they look at homosexual marriage, they think more like the world than they do like the Bible.
Yeah, they're starting to see the laws of God and the commands of God as advice from God.
Yeah.
And so if I don't have to necessarily heed the advice.
Yeah. Thank you for the advice, but I'm going to do my thing.
Yeah, we live in a world that just we're given advice from all sorts of places. We're inundated with information and we don't know what to do with that. And unfortunately, we've turned the biblical narrative into something similar to that, and that we see it just as some advice to be heeded instead of news to be proclaimed. And news to be proclaimed not only is with our lips, but it's also with our lives. And so one of the unfortunate things is that when we're not living by the book, it's hard to testify to the book.
Yeah, it certainly is. And back to that issue of advice, when you are inundated with information, and your generation has been inundated, your generation lives in what I call a media storm: television and the internet and cell phones and video games. As a matter of fact, your generation probably more involved in video games than any generation before, as well as computers and everything else. Then just this cacophony of voices, the Bible just becomes one other source of advice, but it doesn't become God's word any longer.
Yeah, we suffer. I think there's a term for it called compassion fatigue.
Yes,
that we're just fatigued out. Like we see so sad pictures of Syrian refugees. We see we see the baby that's washed up on the shore. In and of themselves, those are such moving moments, but yet we just move so quickly past them because we know that there's going to be another one that happens right down the road. Yeah. And so it's just we're just very fatigued. So it's going to require us, one, to pull away, but also two, to recognize the distinction to be made between what we see on TV and what we read in the biblical narrative.
Let's take another phone call real quickly. We'll go to South Carolina. Luke, thank you for joining our conversation today.
Thanks for taking my call. I appreciate your show, and y'all have had some really good points today. I'm a millennial. I was born in 1985.
That's a great year, Luke. Great year.
Yeah. Got a fellow millennial here.
I just wanted to say, the points y'all made are good. I feel like they're a little sugar-coated, though. I think self-centeredness is the reason why millennials are the way they are.
Well, that's one that we were alluding to. Narcissism is one of the phrases that comes out of this study too. But let's talk about that. Self-centered, narcissistic. How would you apply that?
Well, just the way we're have everything we want. We don't need anything. I mean, our parents provide for us. We don't go lacking. So when we get into the real world, we want to go buy that brand new vehicle, want to have that brand new house. When we get married, or if we get married, if our spouse isn't who we thought they wanted to be, we get divorced. It's just all about me, myself, and what I can get, what I want, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right on, Luke. I was trying to center my selfie during that. No, I'm just kidding. But you are right on. I have a sweet tooth, so I do typically try to sweeten it a little bit,
Yeah.
but I think you're correct in the sense that there is very much a consumption with self and kind of a lack of understanding of a community, that we've forgotten that we're a part of something so much bigger than ourselves. And so we are consumed with trying to get the most out of this world, but we're not aware of the needs of this world. And I just love what Frederick Buechner would say, like, where the world's needs and our skill set meet, that's our calling. And we've just kind of lacked an awareness of what the world needs, but we are very much experts on ourselves, and we're trying to force ourselves onto the world.
Wow. Any other comments, Luke? Go ahead.
Yeah, the only remedy for this is Jesus. As long as we're thinking about ourselves, we're not going to be fulfilled. We're not going to be happy. It doesn't matter which job we get or how much money we make. I feel like I'm an exception to the millennial generation, even though I am. I didn't go to college. I did go to a tech school, but I've only had one job. I'm a fifth-generation farmer, and that's the only job I've ever known. I've cut a little bit of grass on the side, but I'm a farmer. I've been married for going on 8 years to my wife, and I would say I may be an exception to the rule. I don't have a Facebook account.
Well, you really are. You're down to kind of a fraction of a percent compared to a lot of the millennials. Very good.
But I guess I do want to say that there are, I guess, people like me, I guess. So, we can't just say that all millennials are the same, but I appreciate the point y'all are making, and unfortunately it's a point that I believe is focused around self-centeredness.
Yeah, it certainly is. And again, one of the things I should say, and we will certainly next week, is because this is such a diverse generation ethnically as well as theologically and philosophically, any trend we see has exceptions. But what about this? Jean Twenge, we talk about that individual. She wrote The Narcissism, our Narcissistic Epidemic, and she really was talking about your generation, wasn't she?
You know what I love so much about Twenge's work, but also what Luke is kind of speaking to, is that Luke has caught a vision of what Jesus speaks about in Acts 20:35, when he talks about how it's greater to give than to receive. That millennials are so consumed, for better or for worse, millennials place themselves as priority, pulling themselves up by their own bootstraps, looking out for themselves in this dog-eat-dog world, because they believe that they have to be their biggest advocate in this world. Yeah. When in reality, what Jesus is offering is a counter-narrative, in the sense that it's greater to give than to receive, that we have come not to be served, but to serve, and then to find the joy in that and the provision of God in that as well. And Luke has caught a vision of that, and increasingly, as more millennials like Luke begin to live out their lives, I think it's going to create an alluring factor that's going to bring more millennials into the mix.
I think so. And that is a perfect setup for next week. What would be attractive to millennials, and how churches and Christians can be attractive to this generation. We, as always, are out of time before we're out of phone calls or out of topics, but that's why we're going to have you back in next Wednesday. So we're going to see you Friday too, aren't you?
I'll be here.
Yeah,
I'll be
so
here.
we're going to have our weekend edition, and this time we'll have Debbie Georgiadis and you, because both Kelly Shackelford and Benedexter will be out, so we'll have a chance to do some things without them, and we look forward to this. So again, go to the denisonforum.org. We have those links on our website. Don't forget, we do have this Alaska cruise, and my commentary today is on the cost of the wall compared to the federal government. It's all available at the website, pointofview.net. I want to thank Doug and Andrew and Catherine and Shamila for their help behind the scenes. Have a great day, and we will see you back here on Point of View tomorrow.
Why does Kerby Anderson do what he does? Because he believes in God's ability to use you to make a difference.
There's a real need for us to articulate a responsible biblical perspective and to give people an understanding of what is happening in the world, and in addition to educating them, to then empower them to go out and make a difference for Christ.
Together we can push back the growing darkness. It's not going to be easy, but by God's grace, it is happening, one person, one community at a time. Join us in this mission. Become a monthly partner. $1 a day, $30 a month will make a huge difference. Or perhaps you can do $100 a month. We need partners of all sizes. We need you. Give today online at pointofview.net. At the top of the page, next to the Donate Now button, click on Become a Monthly Partner. Pointofview.net. Mail your donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, or call 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I'm constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.